The wind, a dry tongue, licked at the raw edges of the canyon, whispering secrets only the dust devils seemed to comprehend. Ilara felt it on her skin, a familiar caress, a constant companion in this vast, unblinking land. Her days were measured by the sun's slow arc, by the needs of the few stubborn animals that shared her solitude. The ranch, a legacy of silence and sorrow, clung to the parched earth like a burr. She moved through its rhythms with a practiced economy of motion, her heart a tightly furrowed bud, unwilling to bloom in such arid soil. This evening the sky bled orange and purple, a bruise on the horizon, and the air grew heavy, expectant. A storm, perhaps, or something else. She paused by the corral, her hand resting on the weathered wood, worn smooth by years of sun and her own touch. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, down where the creek bed snaked like a dying serpent, not a coyote, too large, too hesitant. She squinted, her gaze sharp, honed by a life that demanded vigilance. A man, or the shape of one, stumbling, listing like a ship caught in a current too strong. He was a silhouette against the dying light, ragged, broken. Her hand instinctively went to the small of her back, where the weight of her father's old pistol offered a cold comfort. He drew closer, each step an agony. The light caught him then, what was left of his face, a ruin. One side, a web of scarred flesh, pulled taut, glistening as if still weeping from the fire that had birthed it. The other, untouched, held an eye that seemed to absorb all the fading light, bottomless. He didn't speak, just stood there, swaying, a broken branch about to fall. Dust caked his tattered clothes, clung to the raw map of his suffering. He smelled of ash and fear and a journey that had taken more than miles. Ilara said nothing. Her own face remained still, a mask carved from the same stoicism as the landscape. Words were sparse currency here. Action spoke louder, truer. She looked at his hands, calloused, trembling slightly. Not the hands of a thief, she thought. Too worn, too tired. He carried no weapon she could see, only the burden of his own broken form. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his boots, tugging at the remnants of his shirt. He swayed again, and for a moment she thought he would collapse. He lifted his good eye to meet hers. A question in its depth. A plea, not for help perhaps, just for cessation. She gave a curt nod towards the barn. There, straw's clean. He blinked, slow. A tremor ran through him. He took a hesitant step, then another, towards the gaping maw of the barn, a refuge of shadows and the scent of old hay. She watched him go, a tall man made small by what had happened to him. The barn door creaked shut, a sound swallowed by the rising wind. Ilara turned back to the house, the pistol still cold against her spine. The whispers would come. They always did. But tonight, the man, whatever his story, would sleep. Truth, she knew, wasn't something shouted from the rooftops or carried on the breath of gossip. It was a quiet seed, planted in observation, watered by time, and sometimes it needed shelter to even begin to sprout. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the dust, each one a dark coin on the thirsty ground. She didn't look back. Inside her small cabin, the lamplight cast long shadows, dancing with the ghosts of her own unspoken past. The scent of rain, clean and sharp, mingled with the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke from her stove. She moved with an ingrained grace, preparing a simple meal, the silence of the room broken only by the clink of pottery, the hiss of the kettle. Her mind, however, was not on the mundane tasks. It was out in the barn, with the stranger and the storm. There was a hollowness in the man's gaze, a desolation that resonated with a chord deep within her, a chord she rarely allowed to vibrate. She had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the days that followed the fever, the silence, the small, unmarked graves on the rise behind the cottonwoods. Solitude had been her choice, then her prison, then her companion. She understood its language, its weight. The rumors, when they arrived, would be loud, insistent, shaped by fear and the hunger for drama that even this isolated land could not entirely escape. They would paint him a monster, a fiend. His face, a canvas of past violence, would be their proof. But she had seen his eyes. The raw vulnerability in that one good eye. The exhaustion that was more than physical. She had seen the way his shoulders sagged, not with menace, but with a crushing weariness. He had sought shelter, not conquest. He had obeyed her silent command without question. These were small things, perhaps, but in her world, small things often held the greatest weight. The storm broke fully then, a catharsis of thunder and sheeting rain. It beat against the roof, against the windows, a wild, untamed force. Ilara sat by the table, her meal untouched, listening. The barn was sturdy. It would hold. But the man inside? What storms raged within him? What had brought him to her doorstep? A broken piece of flotsam washed ashore by a tide of unknown tragedy. She thought of the phrase her father used to repeat, his voice rough as homespun cloth. Don't judge a horse by its coat, Ellie. Look at its heart. Its spirit. But how did one see a man's heart when it was hidden behind such a fearsome mask, when his spirit seemed all but extinguished? Perhaps, she mused, you didn't look. Perhaps you waited. You watched. You allowed the silence to speak. You offered a small space, a moment of respite, and saw what, if anything, grew there. The decision to let him stay, even for a night, was not born of recklessness. It was an act of quiet defiance against the easy condemnations of the world, a world that had offered her little kindness. It was, perhaps, an act of faith, though in what, she could not yet name. Only that there was more to any story than the first, brutal telling. The wind howled, and the rain lashed down, and Ilara sat in her lamplit silence, waiting for the dawn, and for whatever truths it might begin to reveal. The dawn arrived pale and washed, the land scrubbed clean by the night's fury. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and bruised sage. Ilara was already moving, her chores a familiar rhythm against the quiet canvas of the morning. She found him by the water trough, scooping water with cupped hands to his ravaged face. He moved slowly, stiffly, as if every joint ached. He didn't startle when she approached, merely paused, water dripping from his chin, his one good eye regarding her with that same unnerving stillness. Coffee, she said, the word a small offering in the vast space between them. She didn't wait for an answer, turning back towards the cabin. Later, as she mucked out the stall of her old mare Petal, she saw him. He was standing by the corral fence, watching the horses with an unreadable expression. His hands, those large calloused hands, rested on the top rail. He wasn't doing anything, just observing. When Petal whickered, a soft, inquiring sound, he didn't flinch. He remained still, a statue carved from suffering. Ilara continued her work, aware of his presence, of the unspoken questions hanging in the air. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. It was broken, not by them, but by the distant sound of hooves. Riders. 3 of them, appearing as dark specks against the vastness, growing larger, more defined. She straightened, her gaze narrowing. Silas, for she had decided to call him Silas in her mind, a name as weathered and solitary as he appeared, tensed. His body, already rigid, seemed to lock. His good eye flickered towards the approaching riders, then to her, then to the barn. A hunted look. The riders were close enough now for her to recognize Jedediah Smith, a man whose pronouncements often outstripped his wisdom, and his 2 lanky sons, always eager for a stir. They reined in by the porch, their horses blowing. Jedediah's eyes, small and restless, scanned the ranch, lingering on the barn, then fixing on Silas, who stood frozen by the corral. "Mornin', Ilara," Jedediah said, his voice too hearty, too invasive in the morning quiet. "Heard tell you might have a visitor." His gaze was a physical weight on Silas. Ilara stepped forward, placing herself subtly between the riders and the man by the corral. A traveler, caught in the storm. Her voice was even, betraying nothing. "Traveler, eh?" Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice, narrowly missing her boot. "Travels with a face like that, does he?" "Words come down the trail, Ilara. From up north. Man fitting his description. They say he..." Well, they say he did for his family. Burned 'em out. Wife. Kids. The words hung in the clean morning air. Ugly. Sharp. Silas didn't move, didn't speak, but Ilara saw a flicker in his good eye, a darkness that swallowed the light. His scarred cheek seemed to tighten, the flesh pulling into an even more grotesque mask. Killed his family. The accusation landed with the force of a physical blow. She felt it, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. But she also felt a stubborn resistance. Rumor. Word. They say, she repeated softly, her eyes holding Jedediah's. Who is they, Jedediah? Folks who saw. Folks who know. He puffed out his chest. Man like that, he ain't safe. Not for a woman alone. Ilara's gaze drifted to Silas. He was looking at the ground now, his shoulders slumped, a figure of utter desolation. Was this the posture of a murderer, or of a man broken by an unbearable truth, or an unbearable lie? She remembered another rumor, years ago, after the sickness, after her own small world had crumbled. Whispers that she was cursed, that she had brought the illness with her silence, her strangeness. Words, like stones, hurled by fear. She turned back to Jedediah, her expression unreadable. He's resting in the barn. He'll be moving on. Best he does, Jedediah said, his eyes still hard on Silas. Best he does soon. He gathered his reins. Just a friendly warning, Ilara. For your own good. They wheeled their horses, kicking up dust, and rode away, their forms diminishing back into the landscape, leaving behind a residue of suspicion and fear. The silence returned, heavier now, poisoned. Ilara walked toward Silas. He didn't look up. They say, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her gaze fell upon a small, half-withered flower pushing its way through a crack in the hard-packed earth near the corral, a tiny spot of color in a world of browns and grays, stubborn, resilient. She looked at Silas's hands, clenched now at his sides. She thought of her father's words again. Look at its heart. How did you see a heart accused of such darkness? She didn't know. But she knew the taste of rumor. She knew the sting of judgment. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that truth was rarely so easily proclaimed from horseback. It had to be earned. Uncovered. Sometimes, it had to be protected until it was strong enough to stand on its own. She went about her mourning, the shadow of the accusation following her. The men remained by the corral, a statue of grief. The sun climbed higher, beating down. The day unfolded, each moment freighted with the unspoken. The sun beat down, relentless, baking the already parched earth. Silas eventually moved from the corral, not towards the barn's cool darkness, but to the woodpile. He picked up the axe Ilara had left there, its handle worn smooth by her own labor. He didn't ask. He simply began to split wood, the rhythmic thud of steel on timber a stark counterpoint to the simmering silence. Each swing was powerful, economical, but there was a ferocity to it, a controlled violence that could be read either as the release of pent-up fury or the desperate work of a man trying to outrun his ghosts. Ilara watched him from the porch, shelling beans into a large earthenware bowl, the dry husks whispering through her fingers. His disfigured face was beaded with sweat, the scars livid in the harsh light. The unspoiled side, grimly set, revealed nothing. He worked without pause, the pile of split logs growing steadily. Was this the work of a man hiding a monstrous secret, trying to appear useful, normal, or was it the penance of a soul grappling with an unbearable burden? The accusation, he did for his family, echoed in the thud of the axe. It was a terrible weight. If true, then the man before her was a monster cloaked in quietude. If false, then he was a victim of a cruelty almost as profound as the act he was accused of. The community's pressure, though unspoken now that Jedediah had departed, lingered like the heat haze shimmering above the distant mesas. She could feel it, the collective gaze of unseen eyes, the judgment already passed. They would expect her to send him away. Fear was a powerful current. It could sweep away reason, compassion, even common sense. She remembered Mrs. Power Henderson from the settlement, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any knife, whose pronouncements on morality were delivered with the certainty of divine revelation. She would already be clucking, spreading the news, embellishing it with each telling. Ilara sighed, the sound lost in the vastness. Her own past, a quiet tapestry of loss and endurance, made her wary of quick condemnations. She knew what it was to be misunderstood, to be isolated by circumstances beyond her control. The fever had taken her husband, John, and then little Sarah, their laughter silenced too soon, their small hands forever still. The grief had been a raw, open wound, and the solitude that followed, a heavy cloak. Some had pitied her, others had whispered. She had learned to live within herself, to trust her own instincts, for they were all she had left. The rhythmic strike of the axe continued, a metronome marking the slow passage of the afternoon. A storm was brewing, not in the sky this time, but in the hearts of men. She could feel its approach, the air charged with unspoken anxieties. Silas paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He straightened, his chest heaving, and for a moment, his one good eye met hers across the dusty yard. There was no plea in it now, no question, just a profound weariness. And something else? A flicker of defiance? Or perhaps it was just the stoicism of a man who had faced the worst and was still, somehow, standing. He bent to his task again. Ilara looked down at the beans in her lap. Smooth, pale, each one a small, contained life. She thought of the barn, the clean straw, a small offering. Was it enough? Was it foolish? She didn't believe in saints or demons, not in the clear-cut way the stories told. People were complicated, a tangle of light and shadow. And truth? Truth was a difficult path, often obscured by the debris of fear and assumption. Her father had also said, "The hardest trails often lead to the best views, Ellie." He'd been talking about hunting, about tracking game through the high country. But she understood it now, in a different way. This path, the one she was on with this broken stranger, was undoubtedly hard. What view it might lead to, she couldn't guess. The shadows began to lengthen, painting the canyon walls in hues of ochre and deep violet. Silas finally stopped, the woodpile now a testament to hours of relentless labor. He stacked the last log neatly, then stood for a moment, surveying his work. He didn't look towards the cabin, but walked slowly towards the barn. His shoulders slumped, the energy that had fueled his work seemingly drained from him. Ilara watched him disappear into the shadows. The axe lay beside the chopping block, gleaming faintly in the fading light. A tool. It could be used to build, to provide warmth, or it could be used to destroy. It all depended on the hands that wielded it, and the intent within the heart. She rose, the bowl of beans in her hands, and went inside to prepare the evening meal. The silence of the cabin felt different tonight, less a comfort, more a space filled with questions too large to voice. Her commitment to her own process, her own way of seeing, was solidifying. Not out of stubbornness, but out of a deep-seated belief that every soul deserved more than the brand of rumor. She would watch, she would wait, and she would listen, not to the whispers on the wind, but to the quieter language of action, of presence, of the subtle shifts in the human heart. Days bled into one another, marked by the sun's relentless passage and the quiet rhythm of ranch life. Silas remained. He did not speak of his past, nor did Ilara ask. He worked. From dawn till dusk, he found tasks, mending fences the winter storms had broken, clearing stubborn brush from the small pasture, tending to the ailing pump that drew water from the reluctant earth. His movements were economical, his energy focused. He ate the food Ilara left for him on a tin plate by the barn door, simple fare of beans and bread, sometimes a piece of dried meat. He never approached the cabin beyond that point. He slept in the barn, a silent, brooding presence among the shadows and the scent of hay. Ilara watched him. She saw the way his calloused hands, though scarred on one side like his face, were surprisingly gentle when he reset a loose stone in the corral wall. She saw the patience with which he coaxed the rusty pump back to life, his brow furrowed in concentration, the ruined side of his face a stark testament to some fiery torment. Once, a small bird, a sparrow with a broken wing, fluttered helplessly in the dust near the woodpile. Silas, pausing in his work, knelt slowly. His large, battered hand moved with an unexpected delicacy, scooping up the tiny creature. Elara, unseen from her window, held her breath. She saw him examine the wing, his touch feather-light. He then carried it to the shade of the barn wall, fashioned a small nest of straw, and placed a few drops of water from his own canteen nearby. He didn't fuss over it. He simply provided what comfort he could, then returned to his chopping. The act was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it lodged in Elara's mind a counterpoint to Jedediah's brutal accusation. Would a man who had burned his own family show such tenderness to a fallen sparrow? The silence between them remained, a vast, uncharted territory. Yet, in that silence, a strange sort of understanding began to take root. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was something more elemental, an acknowledgement of shared space, of mutual respect for boundaries unspoken. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised plum, Elara found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the porch railing. It was rough, clearly whittled with a simple knife, yet it captured the essence of flight, the upward sweep of wings. It was unpainted, the pale wood gleaming softly. She picked it up. It fit neatly in her palm. She knew, without asking, that it was Silas's work. A thank you? An apology? Or simply a thing made? A small act of creation in a life that seemed defined by destruction? She carried it inside, placing it on the worn mantelpiece above the cold hearth. It seemed to look out over the small room, a silent watcher. That night, her dreams were troubled, not by Silas, but by fragments of her own past. John's face smiling, then fading. Sarah's small hand reaching for hers. And then, fire. Not a specific memory, but the sensation of it. Heat, choking smoke, a primal fear. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the scent of phantom smoke in her nostrils. She lay there, listening to the crickets, the distant yip of a coyote. The fear was old, familiar. The fire that had swept through the settlement years ago, long before John, before Sarah, when she was just a girl. It had taken her own parents, their small cabin consumed in a night of terror. She had been pulled out by a neighbor, her only memory the roaring heat, the screams, the smell of burning pine and something else. Something sickeningly sweet. Flesh. The memory, usually buried deep, had been dislodged, perhaps by the rumors about Silas, by the constant, unspoken presence of fire in his story, etched onto his very skin. She rose, pulling on a shawl, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cool, the stars brilliant in the inky sky. The barn was a dark silhouette. Was he awake in there? Did fire haunt his dreams too? She thought of the carved bird. An offering, a communication in the language of silence they both seemed to understand. She went back inside, took a piece of leftover cornbread and a strip of jerky, wrapped them in a clean cloth. She hesitated, then added one of the few apples she had stored away, a small, sweet luxury. She walked across the yard, her bare feet silent on the cool earth, and left the small bundle by the barn door, beside the tin plate. A reciprocal gesture. A thread, however fragile, spun across the chasm of their isolation. As she turned to leave, a low sound reached her from within the barn. A moan. Soft, guttural, filled with an anguish so profound it seemed to claw its way out of the deepest part of a man's soul. It wasn't the sound of physical pain, but of something broken beyond mending. Elara froze, her hand flying to her throat. Then, silence. Only the crickets, and the whisper of the night breeze through the dry grass. She stood there for a long moment, the sound echoing in her heart. Then, slowly, she retreated to the cabin, the carved bird on her mantelpiece seeming to watch her with its unblinking wooden eyes. The glimmer of connection, a shared humanity, was fragile, tentative, but it was there, like the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth. A week later, the crisis came not as a roaring fire or a band of armed men, but as a sickness in the wind. It started with Petal, her old mare. Ilara found her listless in her stall, head hanging, refusing her morning oats. Her muzzle was hot and dry, her breathing shallow. Anthrax, Ilara feared, or some other swift, devastating fever that could sweep through her small herd like a prairie fire. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's usual composure. Losing Petal would be a blow. Losing the other animals would be ruin. She worked frantically, trying to get the mare to drink, bathing her with cool water, her mind racing through remedies half remembered from her father. Silas, who had been mending a harness near the barn door, approached, his usual silence holding a new quality of attentiveness. He watched her for a moment, his good eye taking in the mare's distress, Ilara's strained face. Then, without a word, he knelt beside Petal. His scarred hand, surprisingly steady, ran gently over the mare's neck, then felt along her flank. Petal, usually skittish with strangers, didn't flinch. She seemed to lean into his touch, a low sigh escaping her. Silas's examination was thorough, unhurried. He checked her gums, listened to her breathing, his expression unreadable. Ilara found herself holding her breath, waiting for his unspoken diagnosis. He finally looked up at her. "Not the blackleg," he said, his voice raspy from disuse but clear. "Fever, from bad water maybe, or something she ate." It was the most he had spoken since his arrival. Ilara nodded, a small knot of relief loosening in her chest. Not the swift killer she feared, but still serious. "The stream," she said, thinking aloud. "After the big rain, it was muddy. I should have been more careful." Silas nodded. "Willow bark, if you have some, boiled, and cool shade. Keep her quiet." He rose, his gaze sweeping over the small pasture. "The others?" "Seem all right. For now." He picked up a bucket. "Fresh water. From the well, not the trough." He began the slow work of hauling water, his movements deliberate, tireless. Ilara, meanwhile, searched her small store of herbs. Finding a precious handful of dried willow bark, she set it to boil, her hands trembling slightly. For the next 2 days, they worked side by side, a silent, focused team. Silas kept Petal clean and comfortable, coaxing her to drink the willow bark tea Ilara prepared. He spoke to the mare in low, soothing tones, words Ilara couldn't quite catch, but the effect on Petal was undeniable. She seemed to draw strength from his presence, her fear easing. Ilara watched him, this man accused of unimaginable brutality, tending to her sick animal with such unwavering gentleness. The contrast was jarring. The community, she knew, would see only the monster, the disfigured outcast. They would not see this quiet capability, this unexpected tenderness. Jedediah Smith and his sons rode by once, their faces grim. They saw Silas working with the mare, Ilara beside him. Jedediah called out, "Still got that, visitor Ilara? Trouble follows men like that." Silas didn't look up. Ilara met Jedediah's gaze squarely. "He's helping with the mare. She's sick. Best be careful what sickness you invite onto your land." Jedediah retorted before riding on, his disapproval a palpable force. Ilara felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce. Truth isn't something heard, she thought. The words, a silent refrain in her mind. It's something earned. And Silas, in his quiet way, was earning something. Not exoneration, perhaps, not yet, but a space, a chance. On the third morning, Petal stood on her own, whickering softly when Ilara approached with fresh oats. She ate, her appetite returned. The fever had broken. Relief washed over Ilara, so profound it left her weak. She turned to Silas, who was watching from the barn doorway, his usual stoic expression softened by a hint of satisfaction. "Thank you," she said, the words heartfelt. He gave a curt nod, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. He then turned and walked towards the far fence line, as if the intimacy of the shared crisis and her gratitude were too much to bear. Later that day, Ilara found him sitting by the creek, his back to her, staring into the slow-moving water. She approached quietly. He didn't turn. "She'll be fine," Ilara said, standing a few feet away. He nodded, still looking at the water. "You're good with animals," she ventured. A long silence. Then, "Had a dog once. Smartest creature." His voice was low, rough. Another piece of him offered hesitantly. Ilara sat down on the creek bank, a little distance away. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of damp earth and cottonwood. "What was his name?" she asked softly. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Blue. Big shaggy thing, ugly as sin, loyal." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, visible even on the scarred side. It vanished as quickly as it came. A memory, painful and precious. "Loyalty is a rare thing," Ilara said, thinking of Petal, thinking of her own solitary life. Silas picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. It danced twice before sinking. "Some things you can't save," he murmured, so low she almost didn't hear it. His gaze was distant, haunted. He wasn't talking about the dog. He was talking about the fire, about his family. The crisis with Petal had been a test, not just of his skills, but of his character. And in Ilara's eyes, he had shown not malice, but a quiet strength, a deep-seated kindness. The whispers of the community seemed distant now, their venom diluted by what she had witnessed. The truth was still a long way off, but she felt closer to it, as if she had navigated a treacherous bend in the river and could now see a little further upstream. The days settled back into a quieter rhythm, but something had shifted. The shared crisis with Petal had forged a fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. Silas still kept mostly to himself, but the fierce, guarded tension in him seemed to have eased, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He spoke a little more, not in long conversations, but in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a fractured past. One evening, as Ilara mended a torn shirt for him, a task she undertook without comment, leaving the mended garment folded on the porch rail, he approached the cabin. He stopped at the edge of the porch, a respectful distance away, holding something in his scarred hand. "This," he said, his voice raspy. "It was my wife's, Sarah's." He held out a small, fire-blackened locket. It was bent, the clasp broken, but a faint floral pattern was still visible beneath the soot. Ilara's breath caught. Sarah, the same name as her own lost daughter. A cruel coincidence, or perhaps a strange, sad echo in the vastness of human sorrow. She took the locket, its surface cool and strangely smooth despite the damage. She didn't try to open it. It felt too sacred, too private. She loved flowers, Silas said, his good eye fixed on the locket in Ilara's hand, always trying to grow them. Even where nothing wanted to grow, a ghost of a smile, achingly sad, touched his lips. "Like you," he added, his gaze flicking to the stubborn little patch of wildflowers Ilara tended by the cabin wall. Ilara looked at him, seeing past the scars, past the rumors, to the man beneath, a man who had loved, a man who had lost. "What happened, Silas?" she asked, her voice gentle, the question hanging in the still evening air. He looked away, towards the darkening silhouette of the mountains. The silence stretched, filled only with the chirp of crickets. She thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low, halting, as if dragging the words from a place of deep pain. "It was winter, coldest night I ever knew. The stove, I banked it too high, I think. Or a spark, I don't know." His hand clenched, the knuckles white. "I woke up, smoke everywhere, and heat. So much heat." His good eye was wide, seeing not Ilara, but the inferno of his memory. "I got to Sarah first. Little Sarah. She was small. I threw her out the window. Into the snow. Prayed. It was soft enough." His breath hitched. "Then, Mary, my wife, she was trapped. A beam had fallen. I tried to lift it." He held up his scarred hand, the flesh a testament to his words. "The fire! It was like a living thing, eating everything. His voice broke. I couldn't move it. The beam. She told me to go, to save myself. For little Sarah. Tears welled in his good eye, spilling down his weathered cheek, tracing a path through the dust and grime. I don't remember much after that. Woke up, miles away. Someone found me in the snow. My face, like this. He gestured to his scars. They said I left them, that I set the fire, to be rid of them. The accusation, raw and brutal, hung between them. But now, it sounded different. Not the condemning pronouncement of Jedediah, but the anguished cry of a man unjustly accused, carrying an unbearable weight of grief and guilt. Guilt not for murder, but for survival. For failing to save those he loved. Little Sarah? Ilara whispered, her own heart aching. Silas shook his head. A single devastating movement. The fall, or the cold. They found her too late. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The disfigurement, Ilara now understood, was not the mark of a monster, but the badge of a desperate, failed rescue. The killed his family rumor was a cruel twisting of a tragedy, born perhaps of fear of his appearance, of the need for a simple villain in a story too horrifying to comprehend. Ilara reached out, her hand resting gently on his trembling shoulder. A small touch, an acknowledgement of his pain. She had no words of comfort. What words could possibly suffice? She simply stood there, a silent witness to his unraveling. Her own past sorrows a somber echo to his fresh grief. The locket felt heavy in her hand. A symbol of love, of loss, of a life consumed by fire. She looked at Silas, this broken man, and saw not the murderer the world proclaimed, but a father, a husband, a man who had fought the flames and lost everything. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more terrible and more heartbreaking than any rumor. And it had been earned, not through accusations, but through shared silence, through small acts of kindness, and finally, through the painful, hesitant unburdening of a shattered heart. The night deepened around them, the stars cold and distant, but on the small porch of Ilara's cabin, a flicker of human connection, of shared sorrow, offered a fragile human warmth. The dawn after Silas's confession was heavy with unspoken things. The raw wound of his story lay open between them, vulnerable and aching. Ilara moved through her morning chores with a quiet solemnity, her thoughts replaying his fragmented, agonized words. The fire, the screams he hadn't mentioned but she could imagine, the desperate choices made in smoke and terror. She understood now, the haunted look in his eye, the way he flinched at sudden loud noises, the almost physical weight of sorrow he carried. He was a man not just scarred by fire, but seared by grief and injustice. He emerged from the barn later than usual, his movements slow, his face etched with exhaustion, as if the telling of his story had drained the last of his reserves. He avoided her gaze, his usual stoicism now tinged with a raw vulnerability. Ilara left his breakfast by the barn door as always, but added a piece of the honey cake she rarely made, a small gesture of comfort. She didn't expect him to acknowledge it, but when she glanced towards the barn later, the plate was empty. The tension on the ranch, however, was far from over. Later that morning, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced visitors. Not Jedediah this time, but a more formidable presence. Marshal Thompson, the lawman from the nearest settlement, flanked by two grim-faced deputies. And with them, looking both righteous and uneasy, was Jedediah Smith. They reined in, their horses restless, their eyes hard as they scanned the property, fixing on Silas, who stood near the woodpile, axe in hand, frozen mid-swing. He didn't look like a man preparing to chop wood. He looked like a cornered animal. "Ilara," Marshal Thompson said, his voice polite but firm. "We need to talk to your guest." His gaze lingered on Silas's disfigured face. "Jedediah here says there's talk. Serious talk." Ilara stepped forward, positioning herself as she had before, a small, unyielding figure between the lawman and Silas. "Marshal. He's told me his story. Stories can be told many ways." "Ilara," Thompson said, not unkindly. "The fact remains, A family died in a fire up north. And this man," he jerked his chin towards Silas, "disappeared right after, looking like he'd wrestled the devil himself." Silas remained still, the axe held loosely at his side. His one good eye was fixed on the marshal, a strange calmness settling over his features, the calmness of a man who had faced his worst fears and had nothing left to lose. "He didn't run, Marshal," Alara said, her voice steady, imbued with a conviction that surprised even herself. "He was burned, trying to save them." Jedediah snorted. "That ain't what we heard, Alara. We heard he set the blaze himself." "What you heard, Jedediah?" Alara's voice was quiet but edged with steel. "Is rumor, malice, fear. Have you asked him? Have you looked him in the eye and asked him for his truth?" Thompson shifted in his saddle. "Ma'am, with all due respect, it's my job to investigate. A man with his appearance, showing up after such an event, it's suspicious. You have to admit that." "Suspicious?" Alara's gaze swept over them. "Or is it just easier to blame the one who looks different? The one who carries his scars on the outside?" She took a step closer to Silas. He didn't flinch. "He lost his wife, Mary. His daughter, little Sarah." The names, spoken aloud in front of these men, seemed to hang in the air, heavy with sorrow. He tried to save them. "These scars," she gestured towards Silas's face, "are not from guilt. They are from fire. From trying to pull his wife from beneath a burning beam." Silas finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying in the stillness. "I couldn't save them. Just that." A statement of fact, raw with grief. Not a plea for mercy, but a simple, devastating admission of failure. The marshal looked from Alara to Silas, his expression thoughtful. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. Jedediah, however, remained stubbornly unconvinced. "Easy words to say now. Where's his proof?" Alara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the fire-blackened locket. She held it out to the marshal. This was his wife's, Sarah's. He carried it with him. Would a man who murdered his family carry such a token? Thompson dismounted, taking the locket. He examined it, turning it over in his rough hands. The silence was profound, broken only by the stamp of a horse's hoof, the buzz of a fly. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time, seeing not just the scars, but the man. There was a child's body found, Thompson said softly, his gaze still on Silas. "And a woman's, near a collapsed beam." Silas nodded, his throat working. He couldn't speak. Alara saw the agony in his eyes, the fresh wave of grief. "He told me," she said. "He threw his daughter from the window, hoping to save her. He tried to free his wife until the fire drove him back." Thompson handed the locket back to Alara. He looked at Jedediah. "Rumors are dangerous things, Smith. They can destroy a man as surely as a fire." Jedediah flushed, looking down at his saddle horn. The marshal turned back to Silas. "Son, what happened that night? It was a tragedy. Looks like you've been carrying more than your share of it." He paused. "There's no warrant for your arrest. No formal accusation from up north, just talk. Ugly talk." He sighed. "You're free to go, or stay, as Alara sees fit." He mounted his horse. "Alara," he said, tipping his hat, "you're a good woman." Got a strong sense of what's right. He and his deputies turned their horses and rode away, leaving Jedediah Smith looking small and foolish. He mumbled an apology, then quickly followed, eager to escape the weight of Alara's steady, unwavering gaze. The confrontation was over. The immediate threat had passed. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Silas. He was looking at the ground, the axe hanging limply from his hand. He looked diminished, as if the marshal's words, though absolving him of murder, had somehow reinforced the terrible finality of his loss. The weight of truth, she realized, was not always liberating. Sometimes it was just heavy, a burden to be carried, even when shared. The departure of the marshal and his men left a profound quiet in its wake, a stillness that was different from the earlier, tense silences. It was the quiet of an aftermath, the air cleared of overt threat but still echoing with the reverberations of pain and revelation. Silas stood by the woodpile for a long time, the axe now resting at his feet. He seemed rooted to the spot, a figure carved from grief, the harsh sunlight etching the lines of sorrow deeper into his face. Ilara watched him from the porch, her heart aching with a sorrow that was both his and her own. She knew that look, the stunned immobility that follows a fresh encounter with an old trauma. The marshal's words, meant to clear him, had also served as an official pronouncement of his family's fate, stripping away any desperate, lingering shred of impossible hope he might have harbored in the darkest recesses of his soul. The truth, laid bare, was a cruel landscape. She remembered the days after she had buried John and little Sarah. The world had seemed muted, distant, as if she were viewing it through a thick pane of glass. Ordinary tasks felt monumental. Sounds were too loud, silences too empty. She saw that same detachment in Silas now. He was here, on her ranch, but a part of him was far away, trapped in a burning cabin, in a snow-covered clearing where a small body lay still. Slowly, she walked towards him. She didn't speak, just stood nearby, her presence a silent offering of solidarity. He eventually looked up, his good eye clouded with a pain so profound it was difficult to meet his gaze. "They're gone," he whispered, the words barely audible. Really gone. It wasn't a question. It was the final, crushing acknowledgement of a truth he had perhaps been fleeing, in some way, ever since he stumbled out of that inferno. Ilara nodded, her own eyes stinging. "Yes," she said softly. "But Mary and little Sarah, they live on, Silas. In you, in your memory of them." He shook his head, a violent, despairing gesture. "I should have saved them. A man protects his family." "You tried," Ilara insisted, her voice firm but gentle. "You fought the fire. You carry its marks. Sometimes, Silas, even when we fight with all our strength, the fire wins. It doesn't mean we failed. It means the fire was too strong." She thought of her own parents, consumed by flames. She had been a child, helpless. He had been a man, and still, helpless against such a raging force. The guilt of the survivor was a heavy cloak, one he had worn for too long. He sank to his knees, the strength seeming to leave his body all at once. He didn't weep, not with tears, but a dry, racking sound came from his chest, a sound of utter desolation. Ilara knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his slumped shoulder. She didn't offer platitudes, no easy words of comfort. There were none. She simply stayed, sharing the silence, sharing the sorrow, a steadfast presence against the overwhelming tide of his grief. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them, but neither moved. Time seemed to stretch, to dissolve. There was only the dust, the heat, and the shared burden of human suffering. After what felt like an eternity, Silas slowly raised his head. His eye was clearer now, as if the storm of his grief had passed, leaving behind a ravaged but calmer landscape. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, his voice raspy. For believing me when no one else would." "Truth isn't about belief, Silas," she replied, her gaze steady. "It's about seeing. I saw you. Not the monster they painted, but the man." He looked at her then, a long, searching look, and for the first time she saw not just pain in his eye, but a flicker of something else. Gratitude, and perhaps the first faint glimmer of a will to live, not just exist. He got to his feet slowly, a little unsteadily. He picked up the axe. For a moment, Ilara tensed, but he merely leaned it against the woodpile, a tool set aside. He looked around the small ranch, at the cabin, the barn, the distant mountains, as if seeing it for the first time. "The locket," he said. "May I?" Ilara nodded, pulling it from her pocket. She placed it in his scarred palm. He closed his hand around it, holding it tight, a tangible link to a love that fire could not entirely destroy. "I think," he said, his voice still rough, "I need to be still for a while." He turned and walked towards the barn, not with the hunted weariness of before, but with a slow, deliberate tread. The tread of a man who had faced his demons and, though terribly wounded, was still standing. Ilara watched him go. The weight of the truth was immense, a shared burden now. But in that sharing, perhaps, lay the first tentative steps towards healing, for both of them. The community would still whisper, no doubt. Fear and suspicion did not die easily. But Alara knew what she knew, and that, for now, was enough. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, a fitting canvas for a day that had seen so much sorrow laid bare. The days that followed were quiet, imbued with a new, fragile peace. The specter of accusation had been banished, replaced by the acknowledged ghost of tragedy. Silas continued his work around the ranch, but there was a difference in him. The driven, almost frantic energy was gone. In its place was a slower, more deliberate rhythm, the movements of a man still burdened, but no longer hunted. He spoke more freely, not often, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, tinged with a gentle melancholy. He told Alara small stories about Mary, about her laugh, the way she hummed when she baked. He spoke of little Sarah's fascination with butterflies, her fearless attempts to climb every tree. These were not outpourings of grief, but quiet acts of remembrance, of keeping their spirits alive in the telling. Alara listened, her heart a still pool reflecting his sorrow and his love. She, in turn, found herself speaking of John, of her own Sarah, memories she had kept locked away for years, too precious, too painful to share. In the shared space of their separate griefs, a common ground was found. The barn was no longer just a shelter for Silas. It had become a sanctuary, a place where he could begin the slow, arduous process of piecing together the fragments of his shattered self. Alara would sometimes see him sitting in the doorway in the late afternoon, the fire-blackened locket in his hand, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun bled color into the sky. He was not looking for escape, she thought, but perhaps for a way to integrate the past into a future he hadn't dared to imagine. One morning, Alara found him by Petal's stall, gently grooming the old mare. Petal leaned into his touch, her eyes soft. He had fashioned a small makeshift brush from stiff grasses bound with twine, and his movements were soothing, practiced. "She reminds me a little of a pony I had," he said without looking up. "When I was a boy, stubborn as a mule, but a good heart." A small smile touched his lips. Alara leaned against the stall door, watching them. The harsh lines on his scarred face seemed to have softened. The haunted look in his eye was still there. Perhaps it would always be, but it was overlaid now with a quiet acceptance. "What will you do, Silas?" she asked softly, the question one she had been wanting to ask, but had hesitated to voice. He paused in his grooming, his hand resting on Petal's neck. He looked out through the barn door, towards the vast, open land. "I don't rightly know, Alara," he admitted. "For a long time, all I did was run. From the talk, from myself, I reckon," he sighed. "There's nothing left for me back there. No home to return to." His gaze met hers. "You gave me a place to stop running. A place to breathe." "This land," Alara said, her voice thoughtful, "it can be harsh, but it can also heal if you let it." Silas nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe so." He didn't speak of leaving, and Alara didn't press him. His presence had become a quiet constant in her solitary life, a life that felt less solitary now. The rhythms of the ranch absorbed him, and he, in turn, contributed to its sustenance. He repaired the sagging roof of the chicken coop, dug a new irrigation ditch for her small vegetable patch, his strong hands shaping the earth with a farmer's instinct. The community kept its distance. Jedediah Smith was rarely seen, and when he was, he offered a curt, embarrassed nod and hurried on his way. The whispers hadn't died completely, Alara knew. Some would always believe the worst, their minds closed to any truth but their own prejudice. But they no longer held the power to wound, not Alara, and perhaps not even Silas anymore. One evening, as the crickets began their nightly song, Alara sat on her porch, watching the stars emerge in the velvety sky. Silas was nearby, whittling a piece of wood, the shavings falling like pale snow around his boots. He was carving another bird, this one larger, its wings spread as if about to take flight. Mary loved the stars, he said quietly, his knife stilling. She said they were holes in the floor of heaven, letting the light shine through. Ilara looked up at the diamond-strewn sky. A beautiful thought. She had a lot of those, Silas said, a wistful smile on his lips. He held up the nearly finished bird. This one. This is for her, and for little Sarah. A quiet triumph. Not over the fire, not over the loss, but over the silence, the despair. He was finding ways to honor them, to create beauty from the ashes of his pain. The storm had passed. The land, and the two solitary souls upon it, were bathed in the soft light of a new, uncertain dawn. There was still sorrow, yes. There would always be sorrow. But now, there was also a fragile shoot of hope, pushing its way through the scorched earth, reaching for the light. Ilara knew, with a quiet certainty, that her decision to let him sleep in her barn that first night had been more than an act of compassion. It had been an act of faith in the resilience of the human spirit, in the enduring power of truth, however hard won, and in that faith, she too had found a measure of healing. Time, like the river carving its slow path through the canyon, flowed onward. Seasons turned. The sharp bite of autumn gave way to the cold, clear stillness of winter, then softened into the tentative green of spring. Silas remained on the ranch. He had, without discussion, become a fixture, a part of its lifeblood, as essential as the well water or the sturdy barn itself. The disfigurement on his face was still a stark reminder of the inferno he had endured, but to Ilara, it was no longer a mask of horror. It was simply Silas, a map of his pain, yes, but also of his survival, his resilience. He had built a small lean-to against the side of the barn, a more permanent shelter than the straw bed within. He had even started a small garden of his own, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the dry soil. His hands, once symbols of his desperate fight against the flames, now instruments of nurture. He rarely spoke of Mary and little Sarah anymore, not with the raw grief of before. But their presence was there, in the carved birds that now adorned the window sills of Ilara's cabin, and his own small dwelling. In the quiet way he would pause and look at a wildflower, a fleeting expression of tender memory crossing his face. The fire-blackened locket he now wore on a leather thong around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt, close to his heart. Ilara's life, too, had found a new rhythm. The solitude was still there, a part of her essence, but it was no longer tinged with the same deep loneliness. There was companionship now, a quiet understanding that needed few words. They worked together, tending the animals, mending fences, preparing for the changing seasons, their movements often synchronized, a comfortable dance born of shared purpose. The townsfolk, when they saw Ilara and Silas together at the infrequent market days in the distant settlement, still looked askance. Some whispered, but others, seeing the quiet dignity of the scarred man and the unwavering strength of the woman beside him, began to nod, to offer a hesitant greeting. Truth, Ilara had learned, had its own quiet power. It didn't shout, it simply was, and in time, even the most stubborn minds could sometimes be nudged towards it. One spring evening, they sat on the porch, the air sweet with the scent of new blossoms. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermals. Silas was mending a bridle, his scarred fingers surprisingly nimble. Ilara was knitting, the needles clicking softly. "The land looks good this year," Silas commented, his gaze sweeping over the greening pasture. "Rain's been kind." "It has its moments," Ilara agreed. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Silas spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking, Ilara, about what happened, about folks believing the worst." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's a fearsome thing what fear can do to people. Makes them blind." "It does," Ilara said softly, "but some learn to see. Eventually." He nodded. "Because of folks like you, Ilara. Folks willing to look past the scars, past the whispers. Folks who wait for the truth to show itself, instead of inventing their own." He looked at her then, his good eye clear and direct, filled with a deep, quiet gratitude. "You didn't just give me shelter from the storm, Ilara. You gave me a place to find myself again." To remember who I was before the fire. Alara's needles stilled. Her heart felt full. We all need a place to heal, Silas, she said. Sometimes we find it in unexpected company. He smiled. A genuine, open smile that transformed his face, making the scars seem less prominent, the man more whole. It was a smile that reached his eyes, warming them with a light she hadn't seen there before. A light of peace, perhaps even a glimmer of joy. He returned to his mending, and she to her knitting. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and violet. A feather, dislodged from the hawk high above, drifted slowly down, landing gently at Alara's feet. She picked it up, its barbs soft and perfect. A small, beautiful thing. A symbol, perhaps, of lightness, of flight, of a burden lifted. The story of the man who supposedly killed his family had faded, replaced by the reality of Silas, the quiet ranch hand, the survivor, the friend. The truth hadn't been heard in the pronouncements of others, but earned in the crucible of shared experience, in the steadfast gaze of one woman who chose to see beyond the surface, to listen to the whispers of the heart. And in that seeing, in that listening, both she and the man who slept in her barn had found a measure of redemption, a quiet triumph of the human spirit against the darkness. And so, perhaps you too will remember, when the whispers come, when judgment is swift and easy, that truth is a fragile thing, often hidden, always earned. Look closer, listen deeper. For sometimes, the greatest courage is found not in accusation, but in the quiet offer of shelter, and the patient waiting for a soul to unfold its battered, beautiful wings.